process begins with an idea. This might be a pet project of a lawmaker, or a concern or idea that was brought up by a citizen or industry group. Anytime someone thinks there ought to be a law, then follows up on that impulse, the legislative process has begun. The next step is to write up that idea into a formalized, legalistic description of exactly how and where existing law will be modified. Once the idea is written up this way, it is called a bill.
As a legislator, I take concerns that I am getting from my community, from my constituents, and I start with talking to legislative staff about what laws might already exist to address this, or what statutory changes we could make that would address this issue. And then at that point, kind of decide if we can move forward with legislation, if that's the best option, or if there's a different option, a different route that we want to take. And then that process goes from there in terms of legislative council drafting a bill and that bill getting introduced and the whole process.
Well, the role of legislative staff in the drafting of legislation is very, very significant. We have an arm that we call the Legislative Council, and that is a group of attorneys whose job it is to draft legislation. And so, for example, let's say that I had an idea for a bill. I would make an appointment with the subject matter expert at Legislative Council, and I would go sit with that person. I would say, here's my idea, here's what I'm thinking of. And they would ask questions and then ultimately turn that into a draft. I would look at it, get back with them, maybe meet with them a second time to arrive at what we call an intro set. A second way that staff influence drafting is that each committee has an analyst. They work primarily for the chairman of the committee, but if you were in that role, you would go to that person and they would assist you in drafting the bill and in actually proposing amendments if you wanted to do that as well. I look at it this way. I know how to drive a car, but you would not ask me to race in the Daytona 500. And so these people have that kind of expertise, and that's why they play a really critical role. They are nonpartisan, and they do a great job for both sides of the aisle.
Only a member of the legislature or the governor can introduce legislation, so the bill has to be sponsored by at least one member of the legislature in order to be formally introduced. It is good practice to find more than one legislator to sponsor a bill. The number of sponsors and who those sponsors are is a signal to other lawmakers whether or not the bill is worthy of support or likely to succeed.
Only elected legislators are allowed to introduce bills. They'll kind of start with an idea, of course, and then they'll take that idea to legislative council. They'll talk about it and get with legislative council staff to draft the legislation. Once that legislation is in proper form, they'll take it to the Secretary of the Senate or the Chief Clerk's office, where they'll drop the bill in the hopper, as they call it, and it'll begin its journey.
When the bill is formally submitted to the leadership of the House or Senate for consideration, it is called being put into the hopper. This term harkens back to the agricultural roots of the state. A hopper is a funnel that feeds grain into a mill. The legislative hopper is, figuratively speaking, where a member throws their bill so that it can be fed into the legislative process.
The nonpartisan research staff will also help with amendments and any changes, and any step along the way they're making changes to these fact sheets and to these summaries.
Told you it wouldn't take long.